really going to do this?
Hey there, this is Greg.
And Tanya, are we really going to do this?
From the popular podcast,
Are we really going to do this? Mom.
And Dad, we have been on summer hiatus. I want to say it's intentional because we had an opportunity to travel the world and see the sights. And we got to Florida and Missouri a couple times.
Yeah.
So,
I think you've just been lazy. I won't throw you under the bus. Wait a minute, I already did.
Yeah, there was no bus. You use a tractor trailer. I got all 18 wheels.
Well, there's a few of those around here, so that makes appropriate sense.
Yeah, well,
no more buses.
We for those of you who are wondering why in the world does she say are we going to do this? It's I don't know if that's a shock because it's been a while since we've done this, or the fact that I said there's a lot of things we could talk about. Let's just push record and see what happens.
It's just we haven't done it in forever. I wasn't quite sure you were going to follow through. Here we are.
Here we are. But technically, I haven't followed through unless somebody else is listening to this on the interwebs later on at some point here in the future, which I promise you, since this isn't a live stream, it might just happen. So anyway, it's kind of funny, though, the last couple times we visited with our kids, let's see, 2 of them at least that I can think of have asked us, when are you doing another episode of Ask Mom and Dad? So it is good to know that our children finally are listening to us after all these years.
Somebody cares to listen. But we have said it doesn't even matter, because if we have an archive these and maybe even our great-grandkids can listen, unless there's that EMP thing or whatever and everything goes to disappear, whatever.
It's an EMP thing. If
everything disappears in the cyber world, that's what I was referring to.
EMP is different from ENT, which is an ent, which is a tree in the Lord of the Rings series. The living, walking trees are.
I'm not sure at all what that has to do with anything. I was talking about the explosion that we're afraid of, shutting down all the electrical grids.
I know. I just had to give a shout out to. There's this silly guy on YouTube who does, or YouTube or on Instagram, does all these shorts about airplane mechanics, and he'll start explaining an engine, then he'll break off into this 30-minute rant on Lord of the Rings things, and then come back to it and just say, oh, by the way, I really like airplanes. And he's as geeky looking as they come, but his knowledge is expansive and well thought out, and it just seems like a ramble, but he has to.
And you just like him, and what do you like him?
I've watched maybe 3 of them, but every time I watch them, I'm like, I think they're hilarious, and obviously I've watched at least 3 because when I watched one, then the internet showed me another one, and then another one, and I'm going to quit now because I'm not really hooked up on that stuff anyway. So a lot's been going on this summer. It's been a busy world, and there's stuff to talk about. So I thought we run through some things. First off, why don't we start with what was on your mind most recently? We were talking a little bit. We've come back recently from a sad situation. We don't need to get into the details over it, but it was we had to make a trip for a tragedy in a friend's life, and
and just families that we know that are really struggling through some difficulty with their children, and it was us trying to weed through what is it about raising children, number one, that is so treacherous and scary that when you get the adult world, you find that they have succumbed, I guess, to the culture they're around, or to peer influence or peer pressure, and you think you deal with that as they're in high school or around people who, at younger ages, and we're just seeing it as older ages, that college age or whatever that, and this actually one we're referring to is almost 40, right? Or he'd be in his 40s.
One's about 40.
So it just, it's kind of been heavy on our hearts, I guess, to try to think through and help our own kids try to figure out how to guard against some of those identity questions or attacks on identity. Is that how you would put it?
Well, I mean, ultimately, and while the friends that we have that we are aware of are dealing with specifically, and we've seen it happen in the larger church community. Andy Stanley's child has started dealing with these issues, which led to a large proclamation that the church was trying to minister to people in the trans community in a way that seemed compromising of the basic foundations of Christian tenets of faith. And like you said, it's about identity. It's who has the right to identify who you are, and what is seemingly
and you just mentioned the trans community. I wasn't even getting that specific because I think there's various issues going on.
Trans community, gay community.
One of them is
whatever.
Well, in that situation, just a challenge on call me pronouns or declare who I am from you.
Right.
I'm going to instead change all that and declare who I am to you, rather than, like, from our perspective, rather than parents telling me who I am or naming me. This whole changing the name, not even completely like surgical change of gender or anything. Just call me something different and let me wear different clothes. It's confusing. That part of it's confusing to me, because other identity issues we've struggled with, sexual identities and something like that are in our culture, seem a little bit more like there's deeper issues going on there. These seem to be almost surface level, but again, deep issues that they're not confronting. I don't think they're quite as deep as some of these more difficult areas where people have come from trauma situations young and whatever and have caused this. Anyway, there's just so many gamuts to it, so many angles that we've just been trying to talk through with our own kids about how you raise children and how you attempt to set them on the right course, set them in the right the Bible says train them up in the way they are to go.
Right.
Aim them toward that makes me think of aim them toward the way they ought to go.
So a thought structure here as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking what you said about the deeper issues versus some words and usages of words like the pronouns and things like that. I'm thinking to myself, though, that's that. And then when you said just now, train up a child, the whole idea is that who we are, our identity, and what is how we come about our identity and how our culture says we come about our identity are in conflict. And the culture is lying, I think, but I know.
Well, it is.
But what the implication, the culture's statement or thought process is you find yourself, you find your own identity, while ignoring the fact that the culture is pressing down a certain set of values itself and teaching an identity to them, to people in general. We are instructed in the scripture to train. That means to bestow upon someone else knowledge or identity in this case. Our children get their identity first and foremost from us. And the Bible doesn't see anywhere else where God said, Abraham, you've been Abraham for a while. I'd like to give you a new name. What do you think it should be? You know, Abram. I want you to be Abraham.
He gives them new identity.
You know, it's not Sarah. It's Sarah. Yeah. It's not. You have been Saul. Now you're going to be Paul. God's the one who has been the bestower of identity. And so you're right to say the core issue at the root.
Is that what you were saying? He hasn't asked them opinions about that. Yeah. He's just declared it.
Who you are is given to you by someone greater, something greater than you. And in our understanding of that, when a parent names a child, this is the thing that got me upset and angry to the point of tears recently. And that is to realize that the culture, Satan, whoever, the adversary, those who stand against what is right and true, are stealing our children out from under us by convincing our children that their parents have no worth. Their families have no worth. The people who have given them life, who've nurtured them, who've raised them, who have given them identity and given them a place, are being stolen out from under them. And partly we're responsible in our culture because we hand our children over and tell our children to trust the cultural things around us. One of the chief places being the school system.
Well, like you're
or
saying,
the education structures, because it's not just public school, it's college level and on.
Yeah, stealing the belonging. They've had a belonging. And the culture is attempting to take that away and replace it with whatever, herd mentality or general think, which is stealing who they've been, what they've known, and probably at one point or another was a secure place. Mm-hmm. But the doubts and the things that, we tried really hard, I think, to help our kids know there were going to be people to challenge these things. There were going to be doubts. There were going to be things thrown their way. They had to know what they believed, who they trusted. We've talked about this a little bit in the past because it's about how you see yourself in this mix, but more than that, who you've trusted to give your identity, who has said this of you. And that's why we've challenged our little ones to establish authority in their home with their little ones very, very early. before they're 5 years old, to establish who's in charge, who tells you right and wrong, who gives you, permission and steers you the direction. It is yours as parents to do because of setting up a system of understanding. There is someone that is bigger. There's someone that is knows more than you do, can be trusted. And it is ours to pass that on, to let them trust in God, to help them trust that God is in charge. They may not understand everything. It may not go exactly as they'd like. And it may not be a set of, feel-good whatevers. In fact, in reality, some things are very painful. I saw a adage or a meme or something that was a direct opposition to what you just said. Find yourself. But Jesus said, deny yourself. Yeah. Meaning that once you've found your identity and your belonging, you no longer need to think of it. I've heard you quote someone who says that, thinking, humility is not thinking of less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. Once you have, so once you have understood your belonging and your identity, and it has been given to you by trustworthy adults, and then ultimately by God himself, there's no longer need to search for that and change it all over. So what is it in these children or these offspring of the ones that we've known and loved and thought we understood and believed the same things? What is it that has caused them for that to be shaky, for that to be no longer true? What has caused them to question all of that?
Well, that's a good question, and I think there's a lot of things that can come up to it. I think one of the things too is we have a culture that is constantly in our face all the time. We're giving our children, and this has been an ongoing battle with you and I, even in our marriage and raising our kids. In a world where there is a nonstop flood of information, ideas, contrary philosophies of media, entertainment, et cetera, where I know when I was a kid, I wasn't allowed to stay up late and watch Saturday Night Live, but I watched most Saturday Night Live because I could sneak up and go watch Saturday Night Live. I wasn't the kid that did what I was told. And so knowing that about my nature and knowing that about our children's nature, and Elijah and I were talking about this just the other day, that there were some movies that I would watch with them because I'd rather have the kids watch them with me and have conversations about them than to never know that they watched these movies and had anyone to help them deconstruct the content that they took in that. And so I think to a degree we can't. I think we try to put a stopgap. In our culture as parents, we try to put a complete dam up and protect our kids, which we should to a degree, especially at age level.
Because that is one angle on that. The other angle is, should they ever put it before their eyes? Should they ever listen at all? Should they ever hear these things that go against what God has said for them,
I would say it's better that they don't. Okay, ultimately, I don't think God ever intended for us to ingest wickedness. I don't think that was, but we live in a world where it's going to come to us one way or another. Do we go out seeking it? No, but we also live in a world where I think it's very difficult to engage with the world at all without somehow rubbing up against it. It's going to be a part of it. For example, we've now reached a point in our media to where it's difficult to watch anything on the sports on television without having something that's tied into belief structures that we don't agree with entirely, that might even be offensive to us. So now we stop watching sports entirely. Sports in and of itself is a mostly, conflict-free. I mean, the point of the sport is a conflict in team sports, and we've always teaches good things, but unless you're watching small-town high school football, you're going to run into some things. And even now in high schools and stuff, it's there as well.
What occurred to me a few minutes ago when we were talking too earlier, some of this feels like it's about boredom too. I'm kind of tired of my own life, or this or that life you've given me, Mom and Dad. So I think I'll go out and try some new stuff. Hannah put it, fantasies, living out fantasies. And I thought about the games that they play, video games, different things like that. And then there's the live action role plays where they actually do play out game fantasy style out in real life. So we go and we dress up and we try to do this or that quest or this or that. It makes me think of what you just said, that the thing that happens, I guess, with a mind that is, first of all, blessed by God to have imagination and to have curiosity and the creativity that God has given us, it has to be channeled somewhere if we have not learned how, in safe zones, to channel those things into productive things that add into, build up other people's lives or give us a sense of God's presence in a good place, a good whatever. I guess it just can lead to all these other explorations. Is that?
But see, this is the thing I'm thinking about here is there seems to be, and I don't know if this is a good correlation or not. I don't know if I can jump to it either as simply as I'm writing it down. So
I think C.S. Lewis addressed that a lot in his writings.
Well, I think fantasy, yes, but I think fantasy in and of itself isn't bad, right? Because we have Lord of the Rings, I mentioned earlier. We have C.S. Lewis Chronicles of Narnia, but their fantasy is tethered to reality. And so I think, again, we if we say, you know, it's best to avoid, and I know in fantasy, I'm talking basically about fantasy, like, you know, an article we read right before we started this podcast that if you're going to sign up to be in the Kamala Harris campaign, you can put your preferred pronouns, and one of them was fairies, and that got us off a little bit of this fantasy conversation. And because I didn't know you could identify as a fairy. I also did notice that I can't identify as who, which is HU/HU, which is short for human. So I think I can start adding that to my profiles because I am a human, but I think I should probably put it human condition. Because
so was it boring just to say we were a human before rather now?
Apparently it's too much word. It's a lot of work to say human, but who makes a whole lot more sense.
Hugh or who?
Yeah, I don't know.
Good grief.
I was going to say elfin-kind. That's a pronoun. That would have been that goes to the Lord of the Rings again. Anyway, the thing that I was getting at though is fantasy. The conversation, to me, it still boils down to critical, rational conversations. In other words, being able to say, okay, here's what we rubbed up against in the world today. Be it through theater, be it through school, be it through work, be it through relationships and conversations had in public spaces. What does that mean in relationship to who Jesus is? And what does that mean in relationship to our Creator? I think that the key to, and again, I don't think our children by far are saints.
Or to who God has declared us to be because
where does the final
Jesus.
authority lie? And how do we tether that back? In other words, where is this? This is an interesting thing, but they've crossed a line here and they've gone off because all of a sudden, you know, where do we know that the line's been crossed? For example, I don't know, like I said a minute ago, I was going to try this example, but I don't know if it makes any sense or not. It's like gun control. You know, if you take the guns away, does that mean that people aren't still going to find and misuse the guns? No, it just means that a good group of people who know how to handle guns properly no longer have access to them. But in the same thing true when you've got theater and fantasy, I'm just going to stick to fantasy because we could probably blow this parable up doing other things, but you could say something like fantasy. If you take that completely away and people are allowed to only stick to more concrete things and say, well, fantasy belongs to the realm of devils, you know, well, then the people who are of that are going to run off and make it the worst possible thing it can be without having it tethered to reality. People like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien would never have had a run at it because they were not allowed to do so. So
well,
I'm saying that you want smart men controlling narratives and story. Right now I'm talking about story, yeah.
Because there's story in our imaginations of what other worlds, that in that case it's Middle Earth and the different creatures we can dream up. And the Bible has many creatures that are interesting and entertaining to think about. But what you're saying is if we were to say all that is evil, then we have also created another aspect, kind of like apparently you're comparing it to guns, then that people would just categorize over here, and then the people who are not in, and you're saying like ones who are protected from that, it wouldn't, I think I understand what you're saying. It wouldn't make it so that it was, because bottom line is people are going to be creative. Humans are going to create stories. Our minds come up with imaginary. But you're right, if it's not tethered to reality, it becomes, which is what I was saying before, it becomes something that now, because I don't know really what is real or who I am in all this, I think I'll create this whole new person for me to be. I think what I'm confused about is ones who grow up knowing and understanding God's love for them and His powerful story for their lives and His freedom that comes with knowing Him and being able to seek Him and learn from Him or learn about Him and draw near to Him. Why is that not enough? And I guess what I'm actually saying is it is enough, and yet they haven't found it or settled that or believed it, because you know of people who, once you discover what's in the Bible, you can never discover it all. It's so much there to discover, so much there to keep learning. So ones like this who have gotten, quote, bored, it's just that they've never found the Scripture to fill their minds, to be exciting for them, to find,
Sure,
their life wrapped up in that.
I think what is happening, though, is before time began, I am, right? God, I think identity has a foundation, and I think there's aspects of who we are that shifts. I mean, you weren't a mother your whole life. You became a mother in your 20s. So your identity was built upon. When you were born to your family, you were born a daughter. But before anything else, you were who God says you are. And as a child, you're God's child.
Well, and I don't feel like you come into that overnight, I guess. That's not something you can realize.
You don't realize
quickly.
it, but you
can
as a
start to believe
but
it.
this goes to instructing someone in the way they should go. The parent has the responsibility to help a child understand in the beginning that there is some concrete settings in your wiring that are non-negotiable. One of them is your identity gender-wise. You're born male or female. There are rare cases. We ran into this whole business with whatever it turns out to be the truth was with the Olympics, where some X, Y, Y, Z, chromosomal confusion was going on. But the point of the matter was that while there's oddities, and even in that situation, it turns out that even if this person was appearing female, their chromosomes gave them a huge advantage in sports competition that allowed them that they shouldn't have been competing against females because they were strong like males. So that's a genetic aberration. That's not the way that God intended it to be, and I'm sorry that happened to those people. But that being said, there are non-negotiables. God didn't create anything more than two genders. There's no story of God took a rib from Adam and made Eve, and then he looked at Eve and Adam and said, two's not enough. And so he took a rib from Eve and Adam and made they. That's not how it breaks down. And so...
Well, yes.
And one day Seth, Z, and her were,
that.
I know that, but that's the thing is we've reached a point where we're defining logic based upon our own passions and desires, things that are being tickled in us that are not right, that are not what God intended. And this is what I get back to critical aspect, teaching people to think critically and reasonably, and saying you need to embrace that which is clear, and reject or at least hold in high suspicion things that you're being told that don't seem obvious.
Yeah. I was thinking of another aspect of this, though, is that you're teaching children at a very young age to truly have a correct and proper fear of God, a respect for God being correct, being able to speak into all things because He is the beginning and the source of all things. So, as God says, it should go. So when children are learning that, even if it takes a while for them to understand how that applies to them or what their, place in this world, quote unquote, might be, it's more about them learning to, first of all, honor and respect that God is in charge. I believe that comes through their parents, through understanding and believing and respecting the authorities of the home. And then, of course, we know that the home is a lot of the issue is a breakdown of the home these days. I'm sad when these are coming from together homes, whole homes, where these boys that we're familiar with have been drawn out into this nothing world. My thoughts and prayers are that they'll return, because they'll ultimately see that there's no stability in where they're going with these, whatever it might be, these different pronouns or these circles of people that they're hanging out with who are all questioning their things. If they could examine that, likely most of these people who are pressuring in that direction don't have what they had, don't really have the understanding, even if it's just from a together home that believes and trusts in, to me, God, who is greater and bigger than anything that they can. So it's a security, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Because you know that these come out of the insecurities of fears for whatever, rejection or not being loved or not being thought of as acceptable. I don't know what all the fear is, what the types of insecurities that are attacking these.
Well, I think on the cultural side, you have, like I said, you've got a lot of pressure coming from culture, but you can't disregard children's experiences. One of the things that you and I talked about this weekend was how did we, and if any of our kids out there have suddenly gone through some strange changes we need to know about, give us a call. But how we at this point in our journey, our children are still, as far as we can tell, loving the Lord with their hearts, and they're not gender confused, I guess, since we're on that subject matter a little bit. And the thing that I want to say is, while the culture's involved, when we're a little bit unique for those of us who serve in ministry areas, and you and I have done that for a while, and we've heard this from a couple of different places, not just us, but we deal with people who are missionary kids or kids of pastors who deal with watching their parents be hurt by the churches that their parents serve in. And I want to say this for a second, because I want to say, number one, the first point we're making is, parents, for you, your responsibility is to teach your child how to properly think about the issues that they rub up against in the world, be they walking into them directly or be them walking past it and wind up having it pull it off the side of the road. Pilgrim's Progress style.
And earlier than that, you've got discussions you're going to have with them when they get to ages that they're, I'm assuming that's what you're talking about. But earlier than that you establish that authority in your home, because you are correct. Your thinking is what they need to adopt.
Right.
They need to think like you are thinking. If you believe in the Bible and you trust in God who has given us his words and his truth, that's what they need to be raised to know without a shadow of a doubt. So that when they question and are questioned about these things, that they'll know the answers, or they'll know at least what is truth and be able to fight it. But I think that's established before they are 5 years old. That is through truly the right discipline, which I believe involves spanking, because you've got to correct them on the spot at the moment so that they will not question. They will have a bit of pain that is associated with the correct behavior, so that later on they won't remember that. They won't remember the pain. They will not remember the little bit of jarring for that moment. They will remember the behavior that was corrected, and they will remember your trustworthy hand that was right there to love them after that. Well,
it's important to understand that. Let me reframe spanking real quick. You have to discipline a child in a manner in which they can understand. Believe it or not, when you're telling your child something's wrong and they can't talk, they don't know what you're saying to them.
Don't quite understand
They don't
English
quite
just
understand
yet,
it.
right?
The first words they may learn besides mom and dad might be no and yes and okay, and that's the extent of their vocabulary. After a while, you might as well put an English-only speaking person into a room with a bunch of Japanese-speaking people. There's very little communication happening between those groups. But if I was in a room full of Japanese-speaking people and I'm walking towards a cliff, that person might just, do whatever they had to do to save me, including tackle me, because I don't understand all these people making noise behind me.
Because
I'm about to walk off a cliff.
Yeah, exactly.
Or into Godzilla's lair. Because it's Japan, right?
Right. Okay,
so speaking of fantasies, but anyway, so ideally when you're dealing with kids who are coming up, you're going to work with them in ways in which they can comprehend.
Yeah.
And if it takes tackling me to keep me from walking off a cliff, it may take a little sting, and I'm going to say spanking in that regards, a little sting. It's not like every time a child offends you, you throw them over your knee and you beat the living daylights out of them. That's what I think when the world uses spanking, they're trying to cast it in the most abusive context possible. But when you talk about it in a shepherding sense, and you talk about it in the sense of, when a shepherd is trying to speak to sheep, the sheep follow the shepherd, but the shepherd uses the staff to keep them from falling off a cliff, to pull them out of muddy waters, to all sorts of things that might be unpleasant, but it's life-saving.
There's two different specific scripture I was reading this morning. Proverbs 22:15 says, foolishness is tangled up in the heart of a youth. The rod of discipline will drive it away from him. But then my mom reminded me of chapter 23 and verse 13, which is a little harsher in 13, 14. And I think it's just trying to point out whatever it takes, this child's life is on the line.
Proverbs or Psalms?
Proverbs.
3,
and
13?
actually there's 23.
Oh, that's where I got confused.
13 and 14. Don't withhold discipline from a youth. If you beat him with a rod, he will not die.
Right. Well, that's the point,
Strike him with a rod, and you will rescue his life. So the point is that there's more to this life than just his body that is usable for this kind of thing. But the idea is that there's so much importance on who that child is going to be, that it is that important. And then Proverbs 13:24 says, those who spare the rod hate their children.
Right.
But those who love them are diligent to discipline them. And yes, it takes various forms.
I do want to point out one word here.
Of shaping them and training them. Sorry.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. To move, it says, do not withhold discipline from a youth. If you punish him with a rod, he will not die. I think the implication there is, if you kill the child, you're beating the child improperly. In other words, there's the whole idea of it is saying you're not using it in such a way as to cause physical harm. You're using it in such a way as to correct. And I'm only saying that because of the people who would say that you're going to cause them, you're going to kill them. Because, well, the whole thing is if you beat your child, if you discipline your child, they're going to be despondent and hate authority, and they're going to rebel, and they're going to wind up dying. That's the opposite of true. This verse is saying exactly the opposite of that. And so that's what...
Well, again,
and in fact, to quote you further, to quote scriptures further, Proverbs 29:15 says, "A rod of correction imparts wisdom, but a youth left to himself will disgrace his mother."
Yeah,
we're not to leave them alone. We got to do them. Sorry, go ahead.
Exactly, is that when you love them, you hold in higher esteem who they're going to be, what they're going to learn and think, and who they're going to trust, than what right now might cause them a tiny bit of pain in order to shape that. And that's what I was trying to say. I think it's so important that we understand, as a tiny little one, they're not going to know or remember pain, but they are going to remember who guided them, who took enough time to love them and to shape them. And I just think it's kind of a supernatural understanding, because God's the only one that really gets what's going on here and how He set up the authority in the home to replicate and be as parallel as His authority in our lives. But when we're shaped like that, we grow up understanding there is a God that is to be feared and one who loves us more than life itself. So parents giving up their lives is about paying diligent attention to how that child's being trained and growing, and that it's hard work. It's not easy.
Yeah,
I promise you that.
Okay, and so the first thing we say as parents is how your children understand their identity when they're growing up is you make sure it's clear to them when they're young. It's not something you tiptoe around. If they ask hard questions, answer them. If they're being told things at school or among their friends, because right now it's being constantly pressed down in our culture, have those conversations. Don't shy away from it. Or worst case, don't dismiss them and say, well, you're not that. A lot of times parents don't want to engage in that and truly help them think through, and this is what I'm getting at, help them think through the difficulties that are being pushed upon them. The enemy's not coming at us with, oh, look, you were born a guy, so but you could be a girl. I think you're a girl. It isn't that simple. It is a long sought out structured approach of just constantly bombarding messaging over and over again that breaks them down over time. If they're at the point where they're questioning their gender, then you're not fighting a one-off conversation with them. You can't just dismiss it. You have to begin to negotiate that conversation and build your trust back. Because if they're having that question with you and you don't agree with them on it, there's already a trust breach. So you've got to work to build that back. So first thing you got to do is take it seriously to shape them. But if they do wind up finding themselves following a line of thinking or trying to understand how other people think, Elijah's great at being a kid who says, well, I try to understand where my friends are coming from and wants to have those conversations with me and you about those things. But and he's got a good critical thinking head on his shoulder, so he does pretty good. But the other thing too is when you yourself as parents, I was starting to address this, and I want to close with this today. But we were talking about our own situation as ministers, and where I'm hurting the most is I'm seeing friends of mine in the ministry whose kids have wandered off this path. I mentioned Andy Stanley earlier on. He's not a friend of mine, but he thought I was a friend of his once because I looked like him in the audience. But so I got to talk to him, but whatever. But the point I'm trying to make here is he's struggling in his own family with some gender confusion with one of his children, from what I understand. And then a friend of mine who's been in and out of that church, his son goes to that church, is struggling with gender confusion. And then recently we found out about another friend who's got that issue going on. But in the course of the conversation, what was brought up was seeing a lot of hurt and pain about the way their moms and dads were treated who were in the ministry by the people in the house of God, the church. So what I guess I want to say is, church, by and large, if you're a Christian out there listening, you're a part of a church, remember your pastors and your pastors' children especially are also vulnerable to attack and vulnerable to these same kinds of struggles. And just because their kids struggle doesn't mean that they're not doing a great job as parents. If anything, they're doing at least as good a job at parenting as most of us out there, most of you out there. But I would say to you, first off, I would say to the congregation, love those kids where they're at and help their parents parent them in the right direction. You know, point them back to Jesus, just like that would happen. Turn them back around.
Or at least encourage them and don't double judge them. And that's what a lot of times happens. These kids feel like they're in a fishbowl already. And now they've got to figure out what that's going to look like. So let's go completely the opposite way. So therefore, I can break all those norms down.
Yeah, and then on the other side of that too, as pastors, I would say even more so that onus is on us to have those conversations with our kids. Because they're going to be, how we react to being wounded by people in our lives, especially those we lead, is a story that is going to be taught. We're teaching our children through the example of how we shepherd. It doesn't mean we don't get hurt. It doesn't mean that we don't suffer pain. It doesn't mean that our kids sometimes will see injustices that we'll sometimes shrug off because we have a better understanding of what it means to, as you mentioned earlier, take up your cross and die to yourself, right? But we have to teach our children that, not just in letting them watch us go through it, but we have to talk about the fact that, yeah, that hurt when so-and-so said that to me or when so-and-so did that. But Jesus did this too, and it hurt when people said things. Teach our children why we respond the way we do as pastor leaders. Because our children aren't dumb. They can see injustice, especially if you taught them what it was when they were younger. And when they see it among people they think they're supposed to trust, other church members, it's confusing. And so we as Christians are guilty as the culture of confusing children. And so we need to be mindful of that. And I believe, and you and I believe since we first ever got married, that the key to the success of our relationship has been good dialogue. Us working through our conversations and trying to seek to understand one another before being understood by the other. We're good at it sometimes, and we're not good at it at other times. But we've always, I would say, kept the conversation going. And that's kept us alive, and it's kept our kids, I think, alive.
And I think another angle on this is make living with Jesus and for him exciting, because it is exciting. It is true life.
It's the adventure. Let it be
adventurous and exciting, just as exciting as everything the world has to offer them out there, but more so. It's eternal. This is the beginning of the rest of eternity. And there's so much. There's also a lot of challenge, and you'll have to be asked to give up some of some of yourself, but it will be worth it. His rewards that he promises in his word are more than we can ask or imagine, the Bible says. So That's how it should be. I imagine
it's worth it to sacrifice a few comforts for something greater. So, all right. Well, that's been a good conversation. We're back today, and hopefully we'll be back soon, and not, giving here's what happened this fall while we were away. No, anyway, we'll try to be back more frequently. Thanks so much for listening to another wonderful episode of Ask
Mom
and Dad.